Good evening, everyone. I'm Carla Paniagua, and it is my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, John B. Robinson. Professor Robinson is a leader in future studies and sustainability research. He currently serves presidential advisor on environment, climate change, and sustainability at the University of Toronto, where he also holds professorships at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and the School of the Environment. Professor Robinson contribution to future studies is back in the 80s, backcasting, working on energy policy analysis. Unlike traditional forecasting, which asks what will happen based on current trends, backcasting poses a fundamentally different question. If we want to attain a certain goal, actions must be taken to get there. This normative approach, focusing on what happened rather than what will happen, marked a major shift in how we think about long-term planning and sustainable development. His work, Futures Under Glass, a recipe for people to predict, by the way, I love the title, established the methodological framework for backcasting that has since been adopted by planning agencies, governments, and research institutions worldwide. Professor Robinson continues to actively lead transformative sustainability initiatives.
The discussion maybe that will follow my presentation. Let me make sure, let me see if I can share here. So you should now be seeing my opening slide. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. I hope I got right into program in future studies made out what you sent me. So that's what it says. So I hope I'm correct there. And on my,
Sorry, ready. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. On the left is my favorite New Yorker cartoon, which reminds us that it isn't just about forestalling unpleasant future outcomes that sustainability is all about. It's also about changing what already is the case. We don't want things to just continue and continue. We want things to be better. And that's a large part of the thinking that lies behind the backcasting idea. So I really want to talk about two things tonight. What questions do we ask about the future? So that will introduce the idea of backcasting and sort of how it works, and talk a little bit about use of models in backcasting exercises. And then second, I want to talk about what we're backcasting from. What do we mean by a desirable future anyway, and the idea of regenerative sustainability. So let me begin with some pretty obvious observations. The future hasn't happened yet, and our ability to predict it, to determine what the most likely future is strongly constrained. And it's constrained by lack of knowledge about system conditions and the mix of the systems. But that's actually less important than the other two reasons, because you can always improve the knowledge. You can learn more and find out more about how the system works. With problems 2 and 3, which is that the first of which is that these are complex systems we're talking about, and complex systems are characterized by emergent properties, and emergent properties by definition are unpredictable. That's the whole point of the concept of emergence. So more knowledge about the system does not allow you to predict emergent properties. So that's the second problem. And the third problem is, unlike say climate prediction or weather forecasting, we're actually trying to think about the future of volitional systems characterized by human choice, by volition. And so that's a different thing than much of scientific systems. We don't typically think the clouds have intentions, and that doesn't really factor into the prediction of cloud movement, but certainly people do. So those three factors make it very hard to predict with degree of accuracy. And so the world is kind of littered about knee-deep in dead forecasts, pretty much all of which have been wrong. And I'll just make a quick point here that if they turn out to be the right number, say in predicting energy demand in the future, that might be then being wrong. Because if they get the right number through dynamics that are actually inaccurate, they just happen to give the right number, we start to believe those dynamics. And that can be then just being obviously wrong if those dynamics are not, in fact, what's going on in the system. So human futures are emergent, not deterministic, despite the best efforts of predictive forecasters. And just a quick comment about the complex systems. Obviously, cities, energy systems, and so on are complex systems, but it might be worth considering families and trying to think how possible to predict the future of your family. and what your siblings are going to be doing in 10 years, what your parents, your children are going to be doing, and give a sense of the difficulty predicting complex systems. I guess I would argue that even if we could predict the future accurately, it's not necessarily the question we want to answer anyway. Let's say we know with what the most likely future energy demand of Mexico is in, say, that future might actually not be a desirable one. We might prefer something different than the most likely future. That means that if we want to explore beyond these predictions, beyond the most likely, which we can't do anyway, but even if we could, if we want to explore beyond them, we need non-predictive ways to getting futures we want to have. So that's kind of the motivation lying behind the backcasting idea. And I should mention that I started writing about this too, based on the work of Amory Lovin, who you may know is an influential energy analyst in the world over the last 30 years or so, and he called it backwards looking analysis. So it didn't originate with me by any means, but I coined the term backcasting, and a number of us around the world started doing this kind of work. So backcasting is a normative form of scenario analysis, and I'll come back to that point in a minute. The major distinguisher I said is characteristic futures can be achieved. Working backward from a particular desired future endpoint or a set of goals to the present. And the question really being asked is, how do we get there from here? How do we get to what we want to be or where we'd like to be from where we are now? So to illustrate the difference between forecasting or analysis and backcasting, I have this really simple diagram. Forecasting is to predict the most likely future. And so what you usually have is a kind of uncertainty you can see here. With somewhere within that uncertainty band is the most likely future. And that's what you want to, and so you want to reduce those uncertainties as much as possible. And I said, it's very hard to do. Scenario analysis really grew out of, as a field of academic research and applied future study in the very 70s. So in fact, before the OPEC crisis, Shell had started to anticipate the possibility, unlike any other oil company at the time, because they developed this scenario analysis approach, which really says, let's explore alternative futures. Let's not worry about likelihood. We can't attach probability distributions to these projections. Let's look at what could be the case, sort of a simulation approach, if you like. And so you look at alternative futures. The key point about this is that these futures are incommensurable. They're not versions of each other. So you could attach a less likely future might be another future. No, these are futures that are completely distinct from each other. And so a probability really be applied to them. And this is a crucial way of dealing with uncertainty and developing approaches or say policies or actions that are resilient to the uncertainty of these alternative futures. And this is most famously in the climate change field, underlies the special report of 1990 and the more recent shared socioeconomic pathways, SSPs, that now are fundamental to the IPCC's work. These are alternative futures, and there's some really powerful lessons you get from doing that. But what I'm going to be talking about is not that, but a form of analysis that is normative, because the scenario analysis typically done, that middle diagram, just says, let's develop some alternative futures and what they will look like, what the path would be to get there. They're necessarily desirable or undesirable. Backcasting, so let's try to imagine the future we want. And a big question is, who is we? Come back to that later. And how do we get there from here? So you imagine a set of alternative futures out there. One of them is more desirable than others according to whatever criteria you use. And so you pick that one and then try to figure out how to get from the present to that future. So these are three rather different approaches to sort of future studies. So the steps of backcasting, and this is a kind of simplified statement, but the steps are generally a visioning exercise where you say, what does that desirable future look like? And this becomes a really interesting question of making that determination. As I said, I'll come back to that again. You want to paint a picture in whatever you choose. And that's a crucial issue, is how far in the future we go, because you have to make futures that are really different than the present. You have to go far enough that you're allowing long-lived capital stocks to turn over. Can't turn over, you're not going to get as much change. So you're looking at multiple decades, usually. On the other hand, in the future, it becomes a bit of a game. Anything is possible. And also people lose with the sort of reality of that future. So it's a very interesting question what the right kind of time frame is. We usually choose between 30 and 50 years. We found that people imagine their children in 40 years, whereas if you go to 60 years, it just becomes hard to visualize it in a meaningful way. Anyway, that's the first step. The second step is what's going on now, and this is actually a really important step. What are the drivers? What are the measures, the parameters of what's currently happening in whatever systems you're interested in. If it's an energy-backed study, then you want to know what the current energy system is, what the structure of demand is, and supply and delivery and conversion, et cetera. And then once you have those 2 points, kind of work backwards from the future, saying what would have to happen kind of at an intermediate step to get there. And then once you've done that, you work again in time and say, what would you have to do to reach these intermediate steps? So that's kind of the outline, pretty general, pretty simple. What the early backcasting studies were almost all expert driven. So on the question of who gets to choose what the future looks like, it was a bunch of futurologists, a bunch of experts sitting down and saying, let's do a soft energy path. Amory Lovins, for example, I was very involved in that argument in the late 70s. Let's define a soft energy, sustainable energy system in the future and figure out how to get there from here. However, over the last 4 decades or so, there's been an increasing recognition that it's a bit problematic to leave it up to the experts. In what sense are they reflecting any kind of larger sense of desirable futures than the one they happen to have in their own head? So there's more and more work that is aimed at what you might call participatory backcasting, that involves non-experts, community members, stakeholders of various kinds, and so on. So then you're getting a normative picture of a desired future from that group. They're involved in the actual scenario analysis itself. So that I would say most of the backcasting I know about now these days, and there are the two centers of backcasting work around the world are really, I think, the Netherlands and Sweden, but I mean, there's lots going on elsewhere. But of that work, most of it is now participating in some way or another. So I just wanted to briefly touch on this question about participatory process and why it's desirable. Fiorino said there's 3 rationales for participatory process: a normative one, people have a right to be involved in decisions that affect them; a substantive one, that there's actual knowledge out there in the community isn't known by experts, and that's important for figuring out what's a desirable future; and an instrumental one, which is that an analysis can be brilliant, but if it's done remotely and is not connected to anybody outside the charmed circle of analysts, it's not going to resonate very well. And politicians in general cannot act without political support, cannot act to change things, act to do something different. They can keep going usually, but if they want to do something different, they need the political support for that. So there's the 3 reasons that I had a PhD student, Cole Dusick, who did a dissertation in this area. There's also an epistemic rationale, which is new forms of knowledge, not just the content of the knowledge, the substantive content of thinking can be part of a backcasting exercise, and maybe can even be constitutive, that it addresses questions of identity and may have that. These latter 2 rationales we call the transformative potential of participatory politics. So what am I saying? I'm saying we need the expert understanding, of course, how these systems work, of the current system and all its characteristics. It usually requires a high degree of technical understanding, ethical and social as well. But we want to somehow combine that with the views and preferences of non-expert audiences or stakeholders through processes like backcasting to give rise to what is itself emergent from that kind of process, which is an improved understanding and practice of sustainability. So that's the ideal. That's doing this is to get to a better world. Now, I just want to say a few words about modeling, because you can do backcasting in a purely qualitative way. You can sit down and you can think up stories about the future, paint a picture in words of a future, and then think about how you would achieve that purely discursively and qualitatively. And that can be very valuable. But most backcasting exercises try to quantify, say, the path forward to the desired future, or even the characteristics of the future itself. So there's this value in quantitative analysis. Here is that most models embed very actually strong normative views about, say, human behavior. So econometric models, but embody in them, in their structure, predictions of behavioral responses derived from historical data. So essentially, they're predicting how things will be. And those assumptions aren't usually very visible. When you look at the model or outcomes of the model, you don't see those assumptions. So we want backcasting to be open to different sets of assumptions about the future. In our case, that's what we call the design approach to modeling, where we try to move behavior outside the model and put it in the heads of the users. So we want models that are just basically simulation tools. So that's one way to address this concern that the models can themselves embed strongly normative and political assumptions. All of this means we need to engage users, and models are not very user-friendly, and so they're impenetrable to most people. They're opaque. So the question then becomes, what's the interface people to engage with the quantitative part of the research? And here I want to just I forget where I got it many decades ago, but the point is that model complexity is not identical to understanding. That as the size and complexity of the model increases along the horizontal axis, at first you're gaining a lot of knowledge about what's being modeled, but past a certain point, you're actually learning about the system being modeled and more about the model, because it is determining. So, this ideal size is not necessarily too large or too complex or too multifaceted. Modeling challenge, like these three quotations, Vivek said he was the guy who really created scenario analysis shell, and in some two famous articles, brilliant. He said something really important. The real purpose of modeling is not to describe the world, but to change the mental models in the heads of the users. I think this is exactly right. No model is precisely accurate, and the value of models is the insights they generate, not the specific outcomes, quantitative outcomes. So it's about changing the mental models in the heads of the users. And it changes the game. Then John Hiles, who worked a lot on modeling and gaming, SimCity, involved in another early gaming versions of models, said most people in our culture are alienated from large systems because most of it is noise to them. People lack the mental models to convert that noise to useful information. So think of that in the connection to Pierre Vac's quotation right above. If you don't have a mental model that allows you to make sense of the information you're getting, it's just noise. And so if the purpose of modeling is to change these mental models, that becomes very interesting in terms of the ability for people to make sense of what they're being told and and the world around them. And the final quote from Neil Postman back in 1902 was, "Information is the garbage of the night," and I'll leave you to reflect on the degree to which that's even more the case today. Pure information, just gluts of deluge of information, isn't very helpful. We have to find some way to make sense out of that endless flow of information. So that led us to what we call interface-driven modeling. Don't start with the models and then add an interface to communicate to people so that they'll, use the model. Start with the interface. What do people care about? Start with that. Build the interface, and then, oh, by the way, what kind of model would actually answer those questions? Would lie that interface? So, and my first two grad students that were involved in this back in the early 90s at UBC named themselves after a beer commercial of the time as Mr. Fun to Use and Mr. True to Life. And the idea is these systems like backcasting exercises, the models we might use, have to be as true to life as we can make them, but if they're not fun to use, nobody's going to use them. So there's this interesting tension between fun to use and true to life. Work from the problem to the interface to the models, exactly the backwards to the way academic modeling is usually done. It works from the literature, from the field to the model, and then we got to communicate. So reverse that, and you might have a chance of building approaches like backcasting that will be actually accessible, but also interesting to people. So the interface matters a lot. And this is true whether you have a quantitative model or not. Designing the backcasting workshop in a way that makes sense to people, that's the interface in that context. That's critical. Scale matters. I mentioned about the temporal scale, but spatial scale also matters. People find it very hard to identify with large spatial scales. Like forget global, even large regional scales within their country are hard for them to deal with. So the choice of temporal and spatial scale is really important. So what I would say is we're trying to locate backcasting in between the more qualitative realm of stories and the more quantitative realm of models, so that there's a quantitative component to it because we're talking about how things change into the future and of some quantitative variables that are changing over time, but we also have to be in storyland. We have to be able to communicate this meaningful to people. This led us to our idea of second order backcasting. How do you use models which go forward in time? They all go forward in time to do backcasting, which works backwards in time. That was the challenge. And the way we addressed that was to say, first you start with the goals, as you saw on the slide a few slides ago. The first step is where do we want to be in the future? Then you run your model out from the present and see where it takes you in the endpoint year. In this case, it takes us to a future that's a different color from our goals. We want green, it's red. That's just a metaphor for, whether the endpoint matches the goals or not. So you keep iterating, you keep running the model until you find a pathway that actually gives you outcomes that are consistent with the goal. At that point, those are the objectives, and you can go through the backcasting process of working back and then forward in terms of implementation. So that's a way to combine modeling with sort of forward-looking models with backwards-looking backcasting. The characteristics of this approach, this iteration, you have to keep iterating until you get a pathway that actually takes you where you want to go. It's important to view these higher order consequences and the trade-offs between the different choices. There's a social learning aspect to this because the act of iterating is teaching you something about which kinds of futures, which pathways get you to where you want to go and which ones don't. And so the desired future is in part an emergent property itself of the analysis. So you might end up changing your goals when you see what you have to do to get there. And so maybe you want a slightly different future than you wanted because the one you thought you wanted has all kinds of consequences that you don't like. So we have to be open. The third future isn't fixed and unalterable. It is itself changeable, and that's part of the learning. The interactivity that is needed to do this in a way that really works for people depends on involving the users, the workshop participants, if you're doing backcasting workshops, for example, in the design and the research itself. So you're not just presenting, the results of backcasting, how you use the results, you're involving in that process. That's the participant dimension. You're engaging them in producing the scenarios. You're trying to create this fusion of lay and expert knowledge. And what becomes really interesting is what is that process of interaction between these different kinds of knowledge? And how are they mixed or combined or merged, or where are they not able to be mixed or combined, or there's real oppositional understanding of the way things are or of the way things should be. We did a project called Greenest City Conversations back about 20 years ago in Vancouver, and we had a set of goals from the city of Vancouver, and we ended up doing a number of different forms of engagement. So I just put this slide up because it shows you there can be lots of different ways to do backcasting exercises. It's backcasting. We started with the goals, so we're trying to figure out how to get there. But we had workshops, we had mobile apps, we had tabletop games, social media approaches, performance arts, and we had built our own backcasting modeling framework called MetroQuest. So there are very different forms. There isn't only one way to do backcasting, and it makes a difference which way you choose. A difference in audiences. Some audiences are attracted to certain kinds of engagement, much more than other kinds. And it affects, for example, if you have an online game, you might have a second window to do the scenario creation. In a workshop, you might have 4 hours. So there's very different, and what's possible is different in each of these kinds of modes of engagement. This is one where my two built the first Quest with me. Quest at that time stood for Quasi-Understandable Ecosystem Scenario Tool, but we were trying to convert it into a useful system scenario tool. And so went off and created a consulting firm. It's been one of the most successful public engagement firms, I think, in North America, hundreds of projects around North America and a few elsewhere in the world. And this was Chicago MetroQuest, where they built a little tool for backcasting the future of Chicago to 2040. 50 people played it, either online or scattered around Chicago. So you can reach fairly large audiences with these backcasting exercises, depending on how you design them. The outcomes from that Greenest City Conversations project of all those different modalities were a recognition that different channels of engagement have different demographics, and they have different affordances. You can do different things in a workshop than you can in a third online engagement. We came up with a distinction between persuasive communication and emergent dialogue. Persuasive communication is when we're trying to convince people, we're telling them, oh, do this climate action, or, create this future. It's very much a marketing exercise. An emergent dialogue is you're open to different outcomes. There isn't an agenda behind it that we want people to do this or do that. You want to find out what they want and how they want to get there. So these are rather different kinds of goals. There is the potential to engage politically significant number of people. And I deliberately use the term politically here because if you engage 50 or 100,000 residents of a city, you're starting to have an impact, political impact potential. So I think going to scale is something we should be thinking about big time in backcasting. However, there are difficulties, lots of them, but the one mentioned here, how do you combine research, engagement, and policy? These backcasting exercises, although that we try to talk about implementation, how do you get there from here? A fairly weak connection to policy. So you need to look for windows of opportunity to engage on specific policies and policy. So the overall lessons, I think, are first about backcasting and sustainability. There is a high interest. We find in all these workshops in engaging with residents, engaging with stakeholders, that people are interested in the future, much more than the likely future. It's more desirable, usually. Secondly, that you really need emergent dialogue when you have highly contested issues. You can't assume that there's everybody agrees on what's the desirable outcome. So you can't have an agenda of that kind, that what has to happen and the whole purpose of the people. You've got to be open to dealing with contestation, to finding out what people actually want and what they think about how to get there. And third, and this follows from the second one, sustainability isn't usefully approached as a communication. These workshops or these backcasting exercises as fundamentally a communication device to get a predetermined message across. Participatory world making, because that's really what we're talking about. What kind of world do we want to live in is a more full way to think. So I'm sort of repeating the second point in a slightly different way. On channels of engagement, as I said, we have all these different ways of doing backcasting. And they all have different affordances and different demographics. So it's important to think about which way, what kind you're going to, and different modes, different modalities, different kinds of issues to be explored. On interactivity visualization, our experience is that people are really interested in seeing the consequences of actions. If we do this, this will happen. Notice that's a kind of predictive statement, but it's inside. Hello?
Sorry, we are ready.
No, it's really important to think about the question of user control. The more control you give to the participants, to the stakeholders, to the residents, to whoever it is involved in the backcasting exercise, the happier they are. They like to play. Everybody is in a kind of familiar with gaming now than maybe 40 years ago. And so that's an important factor here. What degree of control does the participants have? We've also found, my work with Stephen Shepard has been kids working on landscape visualization, that visualization can be a really powerful way of communicating complexity. You show people charts and tables and their eyes glaze over in about 10 seconds. Give them a picture of their street changing over time. Boy, they're right there. And they're interpreting it in a very sophisticated way because we're all really good at reading streetscapes. We live in, grow up in, we understand them. So visualization can be really important. And the initial results of work in this arena are you get high credibility, the more concrete and tangible and you make it. You get increased knowledge and engagement. A big goal is this idea of collective agency, some sense of we're in this together. Can we find a way forward that works for everybody? And if that can be done, that's very powerful. And then you can easily engage with the ethical dimension. So the sustainability above is an ethical winners, there's losers. Somebody pays the price, somebody gets the benefits. How are those benefits allocated? Who's paying and ethical issues? And sustainability all about that. It isn't always a win-win-win. Everybody gains equally under all circumstances. Not at all. Our systems are not designed to produce equitable outcomes, just the opposite these days, especially. We've seen inequality, just to pick that one measure, grow vast over time. So the overall systems we exist in reinforce inequality. So these are all ethical issues that really are important for sustainability. I want to just give you an example of landscape visualization. This is a really simple one. Here's a road in Vancouver many years ago. And how do we go from that to this? So this is just a small example, but you can have about an hour discussion just about that transition. And, is it right? Do we want all these bikes? Do we, what about the green space? What kind of living and housing is implied, and on and on and on. And people engage because they can look at that and they can read it. It's legible to them. Show them a chart or a graph, much less so. Okay, so that's what do we mean by backcasting? Part two, I want to touch about what are these desirable futures? What is a sustainable world? And I think this takes us to the question of our cultural narratives. What does world, our culture, tell us about what is desirable? And so I want to start with a very prevalent narrative that most of us, I think, and you can tell me wrong, have been exposed to for decades, almost from the beginning of school. We've had this narrative given to us, and it's a limit storyline. It's that we're destroying the planet, and so we have to do harm reduction, we have to do damage limitation, we have to mitigate, we have to cut back. Often we have to sacrifice because we're doing so much damage to the planet, and sometimes people add to other people. And of course, that's true. We are doing a lot of damage to the planet and to other people, depending on who the we is. So this storyline leads us to concepts like the ecological footprint. We're already at 1.5 worlds, and we're going to be at 3 in not too long from now. And so we really have to cut back. We have to get that line, that top red line, to go down, to turn into the orange. So that's a reduction, kind of harm reduction, damage limitation mode of thinking. The consequences, however, of this kind of cultural narrative about humanity and the environment, and humanity and other people, are somewhat dire. And this happened my kids went to a school where the children in the school produced a newsletter. And so this was the November 795 edition of that newsletter, and a story by Rachel, who was years old, called The Monsters. And I think a very, very long time ago, there was a beautiful world. The world was covered with beautiful trees, plants, and especially flowers. All the animals that lived there were happy. There were little fights. All in all, they were very happy. One day, something strange happened. Some new creatures were very peculiar. They were almost bald and weak. But at first, the new creatures were okay. They became evil. After a long time, they became monsters. They ruined the world and killed the flowers and the plants. We killed the world. We are the monsters. 2 years old. Obviously had some activist teachers very concerned about conveying the problems, the environmental problems. The word sustainability wasn't in common use then. So these environmental, and the teachers are well-meaning, they're educated, they're conveying this. And at 12, you don't have a lot of ability to step back and contextualize what you're hearing in the classroom. And this is a story I think that has been told to many, many people over many decades. And so What we find with our students now at university, they're coming in with a doom and gloom mentality. The future is bleak. Not only are the objective circumstances they're in bleak in terms of incomes and job event, housing affordability, all that stuff, but we're destroying the planet as well. And so things are just going downhill. If that's the dominant cultural narrative, it makes it rather hard to talk about the future. I think it leads to apathy and denial as much as to a desire to change the world for the better. If you don't think it can be changed for the better, you're probably not going to work that way. So I think that's not very motivating. Doesn't anyway, because the end result of this kind of harm, if the problem is harm reduction, the solution is zero harm, and net zero kind of concept. On that, there's a lot of remediate. Things need to be made better for people, not just less bad for the planet. Environmental argument, it's quite scientific. I won't go to that, but that's a whole other issue here. I think we need a different story. And the one we like is regenerative sustainability. Can we find forms of activity, human activity, that don't have to be minimized because they're damaging, but that actually simultaneously increase both environmental and human well-being? In other words, it's both human and environmental. Sustainability is not just about the environment. Environmental sustainability is just one part of sustainability. The human part is equally important. And it's not net zero, it's net positive. Make things better. And you can see immediately the connection to backcasting, because backcasting is about trying to figure out futures that are better than we have. It's like resilience. We don't want bounce back resilience where we restore what it was like before the emergency or the fire or the flood or whatever it is. We want bounce forward resilience that makes a better world. We don't want to go back. In 50s, I can tell you, having lived through them, were not a world I would want to choose. And, the Canadian version of the 1950s, I wouldn't want to go back to that. I want to go back forward to a better world. Interesting in this context because we're net zero are already net positive. And I think that's the right way to approach. No poverty is net zero, but good health and well-being, that's net positive. And I think that are goals we need. And I want to end with one of my favorite authors in this arena of positive outcomes. To Backcasting, Ehrenfeld is a book you wrote in 2008. I will define sustainability as the possibility that humans and others on the a really nice, that's a net positive. It's a good thing. We want to flourish. It's not just less bad. It's the metaphor that brings life to this definition of sustainability and enables everybody to create their own image of what their flourishing world would be. This is crucial. There isn't a single definition of the good life. There's different views. We have to negotiate that in these backcasting. We have to recognize there can be conflict for sure, and we need processes to address that. It's technically an emergent property of a complex living system. Such properties, like beauty, always emerge within the context of the observers or actors in the system and take on characteristics determined by context. So that emergence. Sustainability is only a powerful vision humans can use individually and collectively to design the world in which they live and act so that the possibility of is never closed off. So let me conclude. Backcasting allows us to co-create. So knowledge co-production is a crucial part of this. I haven't had time to talk about that, but that's really an important part of this. To co-create and explore the consequences of desired futures. This is very different information. You get very different information from participatory backcasting than you get from predictive forecasting or even from exploratory analysis. Regenerative sustainability futures focus on net positive improvements in our mental well-being, not just less bad, but how to make things better. That's what we want, right? We want a world that's better than the current world. There's lots wrong with what's going on now. Most generally, we need positive stories of possibility if we are to engage people and organizations in the sustainability transition. We're not going to achieve that transition, say the climate goals of a particular jurisdiction, a city. We're not going to achieve them with unprecedented levels of political support and unprecedented levels of behavioral engagement. We know that. We have to do both of those two things done, and we're failing. We're not achieving that. We need to find ways to engage people, find ways that are engaging for people to be part of the conversation, to express their preferences and to feel that they're being heard. You can have this great process where people get really engaged, they get enthusiastic, they say, this is what we want, here's how we get there. And then it just dies, right? Nothing happens. And the same old, trends and trajectories keep on going. And that's that weak link to policy that I mentioned before. There's no guarantee just because you had a workshop or a process of a few years and people express their views that it's going to have an impact on decision making. So that becomes a crucial part of the exercise. In our work right now, we're doing a backcasting exercise in a marginalized community in Scarborough in Toronto, about 30,000 people, highly racialized community, low income community, lots of immigrants, new entrants to the country. So classic sort of marginalized community, they call them here. But we're simultaneously working really actively with the city and what we're doing is you're going to fail to achieve your own goals because you're not getting the political support and the behavioral engagement. And this is true of every city I know. They're failing to get engagement from their residents because you're leading with climate. You're going to communities and you're saying, oh, climate emergency, you got to do all this stuff we tell you to do. You have to join us. And we're saying to them, that's going to fail. That's not going to work. The way you engage people is first listen. What do they want? We're in this neighborhood. We spent 2.5 years just listening to first mapping, creating a heat map of what's going on in the building up, doing work. Every neighborhood is full of groups, 10 groups, food security groups, transit advocates, or whatever it might be. They're already out there. They're already working. So that heat map, we call it momentum surfacing. Then we bunch them together and said, what if you were wildly successful? What would the neighborhood look like? And so that we created the future that came from their actions. And then we said, how do we get there from here? So, classic backcasting. And then we said to the city, if you can't connect to this pre-existing agenda that people already have, connect your climate goals, you will fail. So you have to actually pay attention to what's happening in these backcasting exercises because there's no other way. There's no guarantee that this will succeed. We're not saying that you will achieve if you do this, but you won't achieve them if you don't. So, and actually they've now asked to help with the training of their climate champions program where they put people out in the different wards of the city. So I think it's a crucial question that you've asked, and it requires explicit thought about how to connect these. What's the argument that would make this interesting to decision makers, as opposed to the people who are doing the backcasting study? But I think you can make that case. I think every city on the planet is looking at their climate goals and thinking we're failing. And so there's a receptivity now in at least Toronto, with whom we're working really actively, to rethink a little bit how they work with neighborhoods. Instead of putting their staff out in the neighborhood and having them go out and, have events, that doesn't work. The city is not the friend of most residents, and they're kind of the enemy. And, they're being reno-evicted or whatever by the city in the name of climate change. So, or by developers, actually, not usually the city. So, it's not going out in the telling people what's important. It's about them finding groups that are already out there and giving them a little more resources to be able to tell the story of what they want. And then to the city to say how our climate agenda will help your agenda. And if they can't do that, they'll fail, I think. So I think you can make the case. It's actually fantastic. So much fun working with this kind of stuff because it really is people's aspirations. And there's so many people out there of these groups and they're doing work. They're actually, as we speak, they're out there working. So if we can connect with that energy, that can be very powerful, I think.
Thanks, John, for a very inspiring presentation. But if you could share some tips, advice, recipes, magic or whatever to help us get people stuck, like getting stuck from their present or the past and kind of imagine the future.
When we started this project in Scarborough was almost 3 years ago. And we went to that because one of the investigators had been and he said, you know what, go to the KG community, Kingston, Galloway, Orton Park is the neighborhood. And he said, go talk to East because they've been in that community for 25 years. They're really trusted. If you try to call a workshop as an academic parachuting into the KGO, nobody's going, why would they? But if Storefront has a workshop, people come because they have a history of working with them. They do service delivery, but they also do community development. And so what we did is we spent 8 months of a 4-year project just building the relationship, governance, figuring out budgetary action, because you got to pay people for their time. If you're asking for their time, we academics are paid. We got a salary to do this, but these groups have the only resource they have is their time. So you have to pay for that. And working out of change, working out partnership principles, because you have to move at the speed of right. That's the standard line. And then we started the work, and we did this momentum heat map where we said, who's already out there? And we didn't know, but knew because they worked with them. So they identified those people. They called them into a meeting, said, do you want to be part of this process? So that's where the city, don't try and do it yourself. Find the groups out there that are doing this kind of work and fund them to do more, way cheaper than doing it yourself, but also way more effective. So we got really high buy-in. We ran that process I mentioned about the desired future and the how to get there, 4 workshops over about a year. And at the end of it, we had 12 groups represented in the workshops that stayed through the 4 workshops. We said to them, okay, you've met your commitment that you gave us to be part of these, but we're going to keep going. All 12 said yes. And what they would say in the course of the meetings was, we never get a chance to talk about this stuff because we're just trying to survive, get the next grant a couple more weeks, and you don't have to lay off everybody on the staff. They're in a very precarious world of constant fundraising and trying to make things, so to be part of a process where they're actually thinking about how their activities in their group relate to the other groups and how that picture of a desirable neighborhood, they didn't have that opportunity before. So we're just facilitators in a way. We're not educating. That's not a very useful way to think of it at all. We're just trying to create a process where they themselves come up with these desired outcomes. And then we want to be a conduit to the city to say, city, you got to listen to this. This is what is needed if you're going to have a hope of your climate targets. So anyway, I think it's possible. And I have a colleague, Patty Romero-Lankow, has a chair, Canada Excellence Research Chair, Sustainability Transitions here at U of T. She spent her whole career in Los Angeles and Mexico City doing this kind of work, doing a lot of work in Mexico City right now. And you might be interested in finding out about that. So Patty Romero-Lankow, Lankao, might be worth looking up. She's working in your backyard.
Thank you, John. Do you think we steal more minutes from you because we have 3 more questions? Thank you. Laura Cristina, sorry. In Latin America, imagined futures often mirror models from the global north. How can a backcasting exercise be designed so that the participants envision pathways to futures ground alternative realities, local epistemologies, and plural visions beyond global north development paradigms?
Yes. Well, what I would say is Gilberto Galopin did the Latin America world model back in the 70s. Bariloche was the group. It was in Argentina, I think, and they did Latin American world model, completely different model because it reflected, as Laura Cristina says, alternative realities, different epistemologies, and plural vision. So it's not only can it be done, you can't, the northern sort of civilized country vision, it's like trying to take a vision at the national level and just apply it at the local level. It doesn't work. It has to be local. Always these exercises have to be grounded in local reality. It can be in a neighborhood or national, but it's got to be to actual conditions. So it wouldn't work otherwise. And it is a problem because, English language is the dominant language. And so getting published means writing in English in journals that come from the North and sort of have a northern sensibility to them. That's changing from when I was a student for sure. It's better now, but it's still an issue. So I think the other thing I'd say on this is the huge paradigm change that's implied in taking Indigenous understandings and knowledges seriously, because it completely challenges at the ontological, not just the epistemological level, ontological level, what reality is. And so, these knowledge keepers have an understanding of reality that's many ways deeply sustainable. I don't want to romanticize things, and because I don't know, I'm not Indigenous, I can't speak for that knowledge. But what I see there is a challenge to conventional Western ways of thinking and to modernist assumptions about the way the world works. So that's an area I think that's really important, is building on Indigenous traditions. And I have the one who actually put us into a storefront. One of his PhD students is doing work in Mexico on water and conceptions of water and the way to think about water in different ways. So I think there are real possibilities there as well. So I would encourage you, Laura, Christina, continue pursuing that idea big time, because a sort of industrialized country model of you should be in even across the European world doesn't work, let alone for the world. And its own whole history of colonialism and dealing with northern economies, etc. So all the more reason to find local and Indigenous ways of understanding.
So in your experience, when you include them in this participatory backcasting, and how to tackle the different perception of preferable future in terms of sustainability when we're talking about like big companies or even housing companies or all this private sector that has big like other interests, but also like a big power influence around.
Yeah, we are not including them in our work in Scarborough because there aren't very many companies, big companies located certainly in that community. But it's a big issue. And I think there's kind of two answers. One is that the we're taking is to deal with government, who then has the relationship with the private sector. The problem is there can be a real capture phenomenon, right? Where the government is just actually mimicking the views of the private sector if they're politically powerful enough. So that's not a perfect solution for sure, but it is the way we're approaching in our work. Is we think we can convince the city to act differently, still be subject to pressures, the sector, but maybe we can have some influence. The other approach is the approach actually that Shell took, interestingly enough, when they went to South Africa and started doing this kind of work in South Africa. And you may have heard of the flamingos scenario. It had a huge impact politically in South Africa. Then they went to, I want to say Ecuador. I don't think it was Ecuador. I don't remember which country it was. And they actually had in the groups doing the work, they had government, they had industry, and they actually had the anti-government militia who were, violently opposing what was going on in the country, were part of the exercise and had special dispensation to come to these meetings because they were obviously, subject to arrest and various horrible forms of treatment. So I don't know how they manage that, but that's an example. That's kind of an interesting example of trying to get very different views in the room. But obviously they had to have some form of protection for that to happen. And I don't know enough to know how that happened. I just know that it did happen. So here's something invented by, or popularized by an oil company that ended up playing a not trivial role in the South African change of government, and this interesting situation in the country I can't remember. So I think it's possible to do that. My experience of the private sector is, especially at middle management, there's all kinds of people there that would like to do more sustainable things by their bosses, by their rules, and by their job description, but they're kind of enlistable in the service of these things. A lot of our students go to work in the private sector, and they go out with these kind of ideals, and they get crushed rather rapidly often. But in principle, I think there is an enlistable sort of body of people that would like permission to be able to do more of this kind of stuff. Maybe I'm naive, but that's what I believe. The issue is how to do that without disturbing the tigers, in the woods that are going to, eviscerate them for that kind of work. And that's the project we have. When we talk about changing the world, we're not just talking about reducing pollution. We're talking about actually Are we talking about non-capitalist forms of economic organization? These are combative issues, and ultimately that's what we come down to. I think is, can we organize differently? I think neoliberal approach has been the biggest single factor in destroying the social fabric of the world, and the commodification of everything has been a disaster. So all of it by just making neoliberalism a little more kind, a kinder form of, it's going to have to somehow change massive. That's not going to happen in a backcasting workshop, but those can be seeds, the idea of seeds of the Anthropocene, et cetera, leverage points, all that kind of stuff. That's all we're doing. We're just doing a little teeny piece, a much larger set of activities. But the more teeny pieces there are, the better, I think.
John, really, what a blast. What a pleasure to have you. Thanks for sharing your knowledge. Thanks for your energy. Thank you all for coming. Sorry for the interruptions, and see you next time. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.